This morning we're going to study Psalm 4. It's a praise psalm. This psalm shows distress for the psalmist. The psalm has to do with some kind of crop failure, probably caused by drought, as was common in the day. Some of the people were questioning Yahweh's ability to provide for the people through agriculture, and they were turning to foreign gods recognized to be gods of fertility regarding agriculture. Because of the reaction of the psalmist, I suspect there may have been a significant number of people involved in the apostasy. Having just completed a study of Hosea, I can't help but notice the similarity of these people to the people of the Northern Kingdom after the Civil War was in Israel. In the Northern Kingdom, the whole kingdom had mixed worship practices between Yahweh and Baal. Baal was a foreign fertility god, and the people were as confused as they were giving credit to Baal for the blessings provided by Yahweh. Let's look at Hosea 2:8 just to give you an example. That says, "She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold, which they used for Baal." They gave credit to Baal for everything that Yahweh did. That theme is registered throughout the whole book. In judgment, God was continually taking back the blessings he provided, which the people attributed to Baal. Ultimately, the Northern Kingdom met their final judgment through Assyrian captivity and deportation. Okay, the psalmist here was distressed, but not because of the crop failure. He was distressed because of the apostasy of the people and their attacks on him. Now, some commentators put this psalm in the category of a lament psalm. A lament psalm generally comes as a result of spiritual, mental, physical suffering of the psalmist, and even, but it can also stem from financial and material suffering, such as in Psalm 73. Here in Psalm 4, the distress is for the apostasy of the people. The psalmist is not under stress for himself, but for others, those under apostasy. In Psalm 4, the psalmist begins with trust in God and never falters right through to the end, making this psalm more of a praise psalm. Regarding the heading of the psalm, it says, "For the director of music with stringed instruments, a psalm of David." It's called the Psalm of David. David wrote it, but there is no information in the heading of the psalm that points to a specific circumstance in David's life. Once again, I would like to remind you that the context is usually not as important under a study of David, unless a study of David is in play. What is important is to understand that our lives can be viewed in relation to the psalm in such a way that we can receive guide for our lives directly from the psalm. Okay, let's look at verse 1. "Answer me when I call to you, O my righteous God. Give me relief from my distress. Be merciful to me and hear my prayer." The psalmist begins with a plea to God by the name of Elohim. In the Hebrew, it's Elohim. It's translated as God. He pleads to God to answer his prayer. As it turns out, the psalmist has a need which requires a divine response. He addresses Yahweh with the name most associated with power, which is Elohim. We say God. Hebrew says Elohim. This is the name to use when a powerful response is needed. It's God the all-powerful. His, or Elohim the all-powerful, his request is for an answer from God when he calls. He actively means whenever he calls. He is not wondering or hoping God will answer. From experience, he knows he will answer. He knows from experience he will answer, just like he knows from experience that God is righteous. He lays claim to God as being his God. He says, my God. In fact, as his righteous God, or as some translations say, the God of his righteousness. David, the psalmist, has already expressed faith in God at some time in the past, so his faith has been credited to him as righteousness, just as in the case of Abraham. So with humility, he requests mercy, and with righteousness, he can approach God to make such a request. All right, let's look at verse 2. Verse 2 says, how long, O men, will you turn my glory into shame? How long will you love delusions and seek false gods? Okay, depending on your translation, this verse says, O men. It might say sons of man, or it might say exalted ones. These are the ones causing the problem. These men are the ones causing the problem. They're the ones moving towards false gods. They're the ones putting the psalmist in distress. These are the ones putting psalmist in distress. We do not know who these men are, but at least one commentator indicates that evidence shows that they are probably influential members who wield the power to affect communal-like worship, communal life and worship. But even if they are not the influential ones, these must be enough. There must be enough of those of humble status to have an effect on the nature of worship. So the psalmist asks, how long? This is a commonly asked question in the Psalms when God seems to be taking his own sweet time in responding to a request on behalf of the speaker. For example, in Psalm 6, the question, how long, is asked, and the psalmist indicates he thinks he may be dead before he gets an answer. It's taking so long for a response from God. Here in Psalm 4, the question of how long is turned to those seeking false gods rather than the speaker. The psalmist regards these men as making an attack on him personally. The question, whether personal or not, comes down to turning my glory into shame as opponents to God's glory, as opposed to God's glory. So this is a question about the glory of the psalmist, not the glory of God. I opt in the form of this personal attack on the psalmist and it being his glory that is affected rather than that of God's. To this point, the psalm refers to, just to prove my point or show my reason for belief in that, to this point, the psalm refers to the psalmist being the one who calls. In verse 1a, he says, I call. It talks about my distress in 1b. It talks about my prayer in 1d. The I of verse 3 is the psalmist, and so on and so forth, all the way through. All of the I's and the my's refer to the psalmist. For these reasons, I think my glory refers to the glory of the psalmist. So the psalmist is in the midst of personal attacks. He is being humiliated and embarrassed by the men of verse 2, presumably because of his support of Yahweh and his blessings in worship. For today, it may be said that by some, how can there be a God if there is war or famine or hunger or even diseases or even pestilence as we're seeing today? The taunts of the opponents in the psalm would respond. The psalmist taunts to his opponents. The psalmist would respond in worship to God. So in verse 3, it says, "Know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord will hear when I call him." Wow. The response comes quicker than I thought. To their taunts and humiliation, he says no, meaning the men of verse 2, you should know, and if you don't know, I pray that you will know. And the question is, know what? You should know the Lord has set apart. The kind of knowledge or the kind of know that he's talking is about the know that comes through experience. The longer you know him, the better you know him. We have talked before about the arrogant being unteachable. These guys in verse 2 would probably fall into this category of arrogant. They are unteachable. For you should know that the Lord has set apart. Note that we have switched from our reference to the all-powerful God Elohim here to Yahweh, which we translate as Lord. The covenant name used for God when he looks for love and relationship with his people. He has set them apart to be godly. The Lord.
Did you know that you're the one?
Pardon me?
How do you know that you're one of the ones that God has set apart?
Well, the Lord has set apart. In this case, we're talking about people of Israel, and there would be people that are faithful to the covenant. Okay, the Lord has set apart, meaning he has made a distinction between, or he deals differently with. He reserves this set apartness for the godly. Godly here for the Israelite would be a reference to fulfillment of their loyalty and faithfulness to the covenant. When the psalmist says the Lord will hear when I call, he means that he has thrown himself in with the godly so God will hear him. Remember, I referenced in Isaiah 1, I talked about the ungodly and the unspiritual and the insincere people lifting their hands in prayer. God said, I will not hear. When the psalmist says God will hear him because he is godly. I think I forgot to cover something. Back in Isaiah 1, Isaiah was relating his message to the people, and he says that when you lift your hands in prayer, I will not hear you. When you enter into my courts, it's like you're trampling them down. I do not need any more burnt offerings from you. I've had enough of that. I don't need any more. He's talking to people that are insincere, unfaithful, and unspiritual. Here he's talking about, and so he will not hear from them. He will not pay any attention to them. Here he says, I will hear from the godly, and therefore I'm in the godly group, and I can call to God. All right, verse 4 says, in your anger, do not sin. When you're on your beds, search your hearts and be silent. Translations are about equally divided in saying, be angry and do not sin, or tremble and do not sin. The later versions of the NIV and the New American Standard say tremble. The ESV and some of the others say be angry and do not sin. We already know that the categories, the men of verse 2, are making personal attacks on the psalmist. If you choose the translation that says be angry, the idea would be that they should wisely curb their anger and leave the psalmist in peace. Be angry, but do not sin. If you choose tremble and do not sin, the idea, which is my preference, the idea would be that since they have chosen to follow false gods, they have put themselves in an untenable situation with God, and they should tremble and not repeat their sinful acts. On your beds, he says, typically means that this is the place of reflection and meditation, and where reflection and meditation are done, and or plots are hatched. In other words, the wicked use this time on their beds to plot evil and lay plans for the misdeeds of tomorrow. The psalmist says they should search their hearts while on their bed. The interesting thing is that the psalmist opponents may even think that they're justified. But remember Jeremiah 17, verse 9 and 10. Let me read that. Very interesting psalm. The psalmist thinks that the opponents may even think that they're right. Here's what he says. Jeremiah 17, 9 and 10. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind to reward a man according to his conduct, according to what his deeds deserve. So the heart is deceitful. These guys that are the opponents to the psalmist, the guys that are kind of throwing God out in favor of false gods, in their hearts they probably think they're all okay and doing what's necessary and right. But the heart is a deceitful thing, and it's beyond cure. Only God can search the heart. They deceive themselves. Their hearts are deceptive. They deceive themselves. I might also add Psalm 14:1, which says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. Their deeds are vile. There's no one who does good. This says they are fools. All right, verse 5. Offer right sacrifices and trust in the Lord. The opponents must have some kind of covenant relationship with Yahweh, for he admonishes them to offer right sacrifice, not those offered by ritual, but righteously. This gets back to that Isaiah 1 scripture I talked about. They may have been making sacrifices, but they weren't sincere. They were rote ritual sacrifice. The psalmist here is saying, get back to making right sacrifices, which would be sacrifices made in righteousness, and they should trust in the Lord. He says, do not be faithless as they have been, but become faithful and trust in God. All right, verse 6. Many are asking, who can show us any good? Let the light of your face shine upon us, O Lord. Basically, which deity will provide me with what I need? That is the one whom I will serve. The psalmist says that the one I choose the psalmist says, let the one I choose be Yahweh, written as Lord, translated as Lord in English, the covenant God, the one name used for God when he's looking for relationship with his people. What we discovered in Revelation 22:4 is that we will see God's face and his name will be on our foreheads. We will be his and he will be ours. To see God's face is to be in his presence. This is the greatest blessing in eternity. When God's face shines, it brings the benefits and joy of his. It brings the benefits and joy of his presence. All right, verse 7. You have filled my heart with greater joy than when their grain and new wine abound. How completely awesome this is, particularly in the face of a failing crop. Even when there is an overflowing crop, in other words, a great crop, and there is great joy. With God in our lives, our hearts are filled with even greater joy. They have a good crop, they're happy, they're filled with joy. He's saying here, with relationship with God, our hearts are filled even to a level much higher than that which we would have when we had a good crop. I might add that for all the opponents who do not recognize the truth in what the psalmist says, they would probably attribute the abounding crop to Baal. The arrogant will not admit truth in any circumstance. They will argue with a brick wall in terms of God versus a false God. God is not able to provide what they say. I hope you, according to what they believe, they hope you will know that when I say arrogant, I hope you will know that when I say arrogant in this case, I mean those who think they make better decisions than God. All right, let's go to verse 8 and then we'll be through. I will lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. The psalmist, yes ma'am?
How do they think that they know more than God does?
It's the way they are. Jeremiah 17:9 and 10 says the heart is deceitful. They think, that's just what they think. They're deceived, they're deluded. It said that they, let's see, where's the verse? Back in verse 2, he says, how long will you love delusions and seek false gods? They're deluded. They just think that they know more than God, and the false God has a better chance of providing for them.
Okay, but through all this, they never say who the false God is.
It doesn't matter. It's a false God. It's not Yahweh. In the case of the northern kingdom, back when we studied Hosea, it was Baal. They were always giving Baal the credit for the blessings that God provided. And this is what they're saying here. They won't, in their being so deluded, they're not giving God the credit for anything. They think that false God, whoever it might be, could even be Baal. The false God can provide better for them than God can. That's how they are deluded. They're living in a delusion. Okay, verse 8 says, I will lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. The psalmist ends up where he started, with full faith and trust in Yahweh, which we write Lord, though he actually started with Elohim, which we write God. So he starts from a position of power from Elohim. That's the name for God when we're describing him as the all-powerful. And he ends up with a position of love and peace with Yahweh, which we write as Lord, who is the God of love and peace, looking for a relationship with his people. So the psalmist lies down and sleeps with peace and love, knowing he will dwell in safety. And most likely that safety means that he is fully content. I'm sorry, I didn't read that right.
That
Most
even if
likely,
God
that
will-
safety means that he is fully content that even if God's will includes his death, he is dwelling safely within that will. So that's all I have for today.